Well, thank you so much for inviting me to speak with you this evening. So, we're going to discuss the reasons to document our sources, who should be documenting their sources, and how to document your sources. We'll go through several examples and craft a couple of citations to show that documentation really is the key to credible genealogy. I'm sure many of us are familiar with the genealogy proof standard, and that was established by the Board for Certification of Genealogists. It includes reasonably exhaustive research, complete and accurate citations, thorough analysis and correlation of information, resolution of conflicting evidence, and a soundly written conclusion based on the strongest evidence. Our main focus today is the second component, but you really can't complete an accurate citation unless your documentation is done in the context of the other elements. In fact, the first 8 of the 90 written genealogy standards address documentation. I don't think it's a coincidence that they're addressed first. We document to demonstrate the extent of our research and the quality of the sources we used, and it enables others to replicate our work. The Board for Certification parenthetically adds that the inability to replicate research casts doubt on its conclusion. In a nutshell, documentation is how we communicate our research findings. So let's look at some examples of how we, sometimes intuitively, judge the reliability of someone's work based on the sources used. This is an image of a portion of a family tree that my great aunt gave me from her decades of research. This paper is really big. It's about 2.5 feet tall by 3 feet wide, and it contains 170 names going back through several Mayflower passengers to a signer of the Magna Carta. Some of the lists or the people on there have names, dates, and locations. Some just have a name, but there are no sources. My great aunt has since passed away, and I really had no way to know if the information on the tree was reliable. I still haven't researched all of these lines, but I've proven at least one line to one of the Mayflower passengers. But it's a shame that really I have to duplicate all of her hard work just to ensure that her information is reliable. Or maybe you received or found a really well-written genealogy or a set of family group sheets. Libraries, genealogy societies, and historical societies frequently have surname file folders containing information like this. Or maybe you found information about your family in a published book. Someone clearly spent a lot of time gathering information and crafting a document showing how all of the relationships go together. But if you don't know the sources of the information or how they came to that conclusion, we are unable to replicate the work and know if it's reliable. Maybe you found 2 family trees on Ancestry.com for the same person. Now, I wouldn't consider a family tree itself a source, but we can quickly compare the extent of research and the quality of the sources that are used. The sources on tree A are not that reliable, and you probably wouldn't spend a lot of time looking at information contained on that tree. But tree B seems to include a variety of sources spanning several decades. So you may review the underlying sources and verify that you come to the same conclusion for the identity and kinship as the owner of tree B. This is a list of the types of works in which we should be documenting our sources according to genealogy standards. As you can see, the list includes basically everything you could be working on. From these examples, I hope we can all agree that we all need to be documenting our sources in order to determine a source's quality for our own research. We need to be able to find the source again or allow someone else to quickly and easily find the source. And if we hope to share our research in some manner and have it deemed reliable and useful to others, we need to be documenting our sources. Now, when we think about the components of the genealogy proof standard, even though it's a list, we can't think of them as steps to be followed in order. Think of them as gears moving with each other. You plan, you research, you document, you analyze, you correlate, you resolve conflicts over and over again. With documentation, you may start with an index, which leads you to an abstract, and that abstract may ultimately lead you to an image of the original. Or you may find a source that disproves an earlier source. So your documentation doesn't change per se, but it can evolve. It needs to be done as you're researching and analyzing. It is not meant to be the final step that you go back to and do when your research is complete. So what do we need to document? Aside from common knowledge, which is defined as information that is beyond dispute, generally known, or easily checked, the genealogy standards advise us to document the source of all information and images we gather, use, plan to gather, or use. And I'm sure we all have examples where we failed to document something. This was written on the back of a document that was submitted to the Lineage Society that I chair, and I'm using this with her permission. But I know that I've done the exact same thing, and I bet a lot of you have done this too. You might go to a repository, in this case the National Archives, and you only have a few hours. So you want to make copies or take photos on your phone of everything you can, and you figure you'll go home and organize it and document it later. And then you come home expecting to remember what you looked at and where it came from, but you have no idea which record group something might have been in or exactly which folder you found a particular document. And that's if you ever actually get around to trying to organize it. Because we're supposed to document everything we plan to gather or plan to use, the best time to begin our documentation really is before visiting a repository as you're developing a research plan. This will help you avoid the situation from the last slide. It will also help you to keep track of negative findings. It will help you stay focused on your research objective. And even though it may seem like a lot of work up front, it will save you time in the long run. Obviously, you won't have everything you need for your documentation in the planning stages, but by writing down the collection or record group you plan to view, you can begin the framework of your documentation and begin to think about the physical forms of what you plan to consult and what elements you'll need to document. So let's back up for just a moment to discuss what is a source and their physical forms. A source is simply a container of information. The terms we learned in school were probably primary and secondary source. In genealogy, though, we classify sources by their physical form and use the terms original source, derivative source, or an authored work. An original source is material in its first form. Sometimes it's very clear to recognize an original, and sometimes it can be difficult to tell. Some examples include letters, diaries, photographs, a tax assessor's list, a will, or a deed. Derivatives have changed the original's content in some way. Examples of derivatives may be abstracts, compilations, transcriptions, databases, and indexes. Authored works are created when a person takes information from a variety of sources and creates a new product. These are fairly easy to tell, but I've seen a book like a cemetery transcription book where the author added additional information that he found from census records, like years of birth or marriage information, that is not included on the actual headstone. So it's not just a transcription, it has become an authored work. The final form to recognize are facsimiles, image copies, original duplicates, or record copies. Facsimiles and image copies are pretty straightforward. Original duplicates are the copies that a person or a family received when they had something recorded. Record copies can often be found in bound books. Both of these forms were meant to be exact copies of what was going to be bound in the book, and it's often, or what was sent home with the family. They're meant to be exact originals of the actual document. It's often the closest that we will get to the original document. So long as the image hasn't been visibly altered, we generally treat these types of copies as with the same weight of reliability that we would treat an original. We do need to remember, though, that they are derivatives and that anytime a derivative is created, errors can occur. So regardless of the physical form, all sources contain various types of information. That information can be primary or first-hand information, secondary information, unknown information, or a combination of any of the above. And regardless of what physical form the source takes or the type of information the source contains, we recognize that the information may be correct or incorrect. Death certificates are a great example of this. 4 different people usually contribute to a death certificate: the informant, the doctor, the funeral director, and the registrar. The type of information provided depends on the relationship between the informant and the deceased. I don't want to get too far into information analysis in this, but this is a great example of how these components of the GPS all work together and affect our documentation. So this is my great-great-grandmother, Alice Reed's death certificate. The informant was her daughter, my great-grandmother, and they lived together at the time of my great-great-grandmother's death. So my great-grandmother had primary information like their address and her mother's marital status at the time of her death. She had secondary information like her mother's date of birth and her place of birth. And I know that my great-grandmother knew her grandmother, but she did not know her grandfather. So she had primary information of one parent, but only secondary information of the other parent. The names of a deceased parents on a death certificate could be primary information or secondary information, or often it may be unknown. Regardless of what type of the information she had, at least one piece of information on this death certificate is in conflict with other records. Alice's mother's maiden name was Voorhees with a V, and I know it's hard to see, but it's circled in blue there. Her death certificate says her mother's name is Martha Jane Voorhees with a B. It looks to me like the handwriting is that of the funeral director, so my suspicion is that my great-grandmother was telling the funeral director the information for the death certificate, or the registrar perhaps, but somebody misheard and wrote Voorhees with a B. So it's just a very good example of how, regardless of what the information, the type of information a source contains, we need to analyze each piece of information and document it all as we go. So we use all this information to build a body of evidence. And the more complex the research question is, the more thorough our documentation needs to be. I'm sure we all have some ancestors where our documentation is pretty skimpy. But if you're trying to prove a parent-child relationship and you have original sources with primary information like a will or a baptism record, and there is no conflicting evidence, you really don't need a lot more. That's why we deem original records that contain primary information a higher quality source than a derivative or authored work, even when original sources contain secondary information, like we saw with the death certificate. It's also why the quality of a source outweighs the quantity of sources. For example, if you find a will in which a father names his married daughter by her married name and lists her county of residence, that's more reliable than the 100 public family trees that list that daughter married to another man in a different county in the same time frame. Ideally, we should aim for at least 2 independent original sources that provide primary information. But we all know that just isn't possible sometimes, or we may find those 2 original sources and they have conflicting information. That's why documenting all of the details from each source is so important. Some details may not seem to matter at the time, but as your research progresses, you may realize that the witness on a deed is the key piece of indirect information to help you answer your research question. So we've discussed why we document our sources and who needs to document, what we should document, and when we should be documenting. So now let's discuss how we should document. And you may have noticed so far that I've been using mostly the term documentation, but we document our sources through citations. And for some reason, citations seem to cause people a lot of stress. Many people find them tedious and confusing. But I hope that by focusing on documentation being done in conjunction with research and analysis and how it's the key to communicating your credible work, citations won't be intimidating. As we move forward, I want to make sure we're clear on the difference between documentation and a citation. The first 8 genealogy standards aren't standards for citations. They're standards for documenting. The way we communicate the relevant information we document is through a citation, but documentation doesn't equal a citation. Documentation is greater than just the final citation. So if a source is the container of information, the citation is simply a description of the container and its contents. There is no one correct way to write a citation. You actually have a lot of flexibility and you have a lot of decisions to make regarding how you want to craft your citation. It's been said that citations are crafted because we create something that completely and accurately describes each particular source we examine. Fortunately, again, we have some guidelines. The first thing you can do is to read and study credible genealogy publications, paying attention to how the authors and editors craft the citations. Genealogists use humanities-style citations as found in the Chicago Manual of Style. CMOS is currently in the 18th edition. If you have an older version like me, you probably don't need to run out and buy the new one. More stays the same than changes. If you do plan to do a lot of writing, though, you should probably have the most current copy. But if your only use of the book really is to help with citations, you probably don't need a copy at all. And that's because we aren't using typically the straightforward books, newspapers, or journal articles that are mostly discussed in CMOS. The next two resources include chapters on the basics of punctuation, capitalization, and mechanics that are taken straight from the CMOS. Thomas W. Jones' textbook, Mastering Genealogical Documentation, teaches us to understand the reasons we cite in a particular way. This book really teaches the logic so that we can create citations similar to the models shown in what I'm sure most of us go to when we need to write a citation, Evidence Explained. As the subtitle suggests, Evidence Explained can help you cite everything from artifacts to cyberspace. It includes models and samples from many of the sources we frequently encounter. The fourth edition was just published last year, and it really helped to streamline and to eliminate some redundancies, particularly in images of documents found online. If you have been really good about citing your sources all along, you don't have to go back and redo all of your citations if there's a new recommendation. If you're going to publish, you obviously want to check with the publisher or the editor to see how they want citations to be listed, but you don't have to go back in your own work because you should have had all of the information that you need to already. Evidence Explained also has a website and a Facebook page that are listed in the handout, and they provide samples and quick lessons and allow readers to submit questions. Reading through the quick lessons can help us better understand the reasons behind what we need to include in a citation. And that understanding is so important, and it's why our documentation is greater than the citation. It's why we don't want to just find a source and go straight to Evidence Explained and try to find a similar model and treat it like a plug-and-play formula. That shortchanges yourself and anyone that you hope to share your research with. So if there's no one correct way to write a citation, are there wrong citations? Tom Jones has written that the only wrong citations are those that mislead or confuse. This includes citing a source you didn't actually view. For example, if you read a published genealogy that cites a 200-page probate record, you cannot cite the probate record if you haven't seen it yourself. Another example of citations that confuse are including citations in a finished work for each document that ultimately led you to a conclusion. There's no reason to take someone on your entire research journey. You want to just include the highest quality sources necessary to establish your conclusion. And finally, and most importantly, you cannot accurately describe something that you don't understand. To do so would certainly confuse someone else. You may not understand a record because of issues with the condition of the document or because the handwriting is difficult to read, because the document is written in another language, or because the document contains a lot of legal or archaic language. We may also have to understand if something is an individual component of a larger record, like a receipt in a probate file or an affidavit in a military pension record. Understanding the source includes, at a minimum, reviewing the source information or the collection description. It means reading the introduction or front matter of a published work or the first few slides of a microfilm publication. You should read a few pages before and after your particular record to see if there are any differences in the format or the style of the record. Is there anything that stands out that makes your record unusual? And sometimes we may need to do additional research to understand the context of how or why a record was created and the information it conveys. We may need to research the law at the time, religious traditions, or instructions to census enumerators. This deed, which I know you cannot read, and so I have a transcription, was recorded in Beaver County, Pennsylvania. According to the Westfield Presbyterian Church history, in 1803, Charles Clark and his uncle Walter each donated an acre of their adjacent land, or their west field, to be used for a cemetery and church. Now, Charles died in 1804, and this deed was written and recorded in 1823. And I won't read the whole extraction, But basically, Charles died before the deed could be executed, and there was not sufficient evidence to authorize his administrator to execute the deed. It took an act of the Pennsylvania Assembly, which was passed on the 22nd of March, 1817, to authorize the administrator, John Lecky, to execute the deed. By looking on the very next page, I found a similar deed recorded on the same day by the executor of Charles's uncle Walter's estate to the same men for the benefit of the Westfield congregation. The second deed also cited the same act of assembly. So in order to fully understand how these deeds came to be, I need to put on my detective hat and do some more research on how this act of assembly allowed the deeds to be executed. As genealogists, we frequently act like detectives or journalists. We develop hypotheses, we track down and consult a variety of sources, we build a body of evidence, we rule out other potential candidates, we write a final report. So it's appropriate that our citation elements are basically the same questions that detectives and journalists use. Who, what, when, where, or where is, and where in. We can organize all of this information in a simple table. I have a table like this in my research report template, and I can extract all the details in whatever way makes sense, and you can use something similar in whatever way makes sense to you. As I analyze or transcribe a record, I pull out all of these elements. By the time I'm done, I should have everything I need to craft my citation. We'll examine each of these in more detail. In keeping with the idea of understanding the source, we'll skip who for right now. Let's start with the question, what? What exactly are you looking at? So the first thing we have to figure out in the what is determining the publication status, because the way we write the what in the citation is determined by whether it's published or not. I like the definitions of a published source and an unpublished source from the Glossary of Evidence Explained. A published source is one that has been widely distributed in print, online, or via other media. Commercial distribution or sale is not required. An unpublished source is a source for which only one or a few copies exist, not distributed commercially, and rarely circulated. This seems fairly straightforward, but it can get very tricky if you're using a published collection on Ancestry.com of baptism records that were not originally created to be published, or a published family genealogy book that contains an image of an original family document. This is probably the most important element to get technically right, but the more you train your brain to think through what are you looking at and determining what exactly the source is, practicing reading and writing your own citations, it really does become simpler. My daughter was recently learning about this in school, and she said that citations are like a secret code, and she's right. The way a title in a citation is written gives important clues. Evidence Explained gives us 5 basic rules for titles, and I'm going a little out of order here because I think it's easier to keep straight this way. And all of this is included in the handout. But the first category is for published standalone works, like a book, CD, DVD, journal, a map, a website. We copy the exact title in italics. Italics are the code that this source is widely distributed. The last category is for sources that are not published and do not have a title. This would apply to things that are not widely distributed, probably only has one copy. Things like a letter, an email, an attendance list for a family reunion, or your great-great-grandmother's sampler that is the only source of her maiden name. For these types of unpublished, untitled works, you can create a description of the source that makes sense. You create it with a typical sentence style, meaning you would capitalize the first word and any proper nouns. You would not use italics because it isn't published, and you wouldn't use quotation marks because there was nothing to quote. You can also include square brackets if there is something that would further explain, but you don't have to, and you would typically want to include that in the description or whatever you're writing about the document. Every other work falls into the second, third, and fourth category, and even though these are separate rules, the rule is the same. You simply quote the title exactly. These titles should be written headline style, which generally means all the words except articles, prepositions, and conjunctions are capitalized. But because you're quoting the title, you place it in quotation marks. These types of works include files, collections, series, subseries, record groups, a named part of a published work, a CD, a journal, or a website, or a titled but unpublished document. And after you determine the publication status, you determine all of the whats. Pull out every detail from the source that would help you clearly describe exactly what you are using to somebody else. This includes the titles, subtitles, volume number, a description of the source if it isn't titled, a description of the physical form and the underlying source information. For example, if you're using an image of a census record that are available online at a variety of sites, be sure to grab the narrow microfilm and roll numbers from which the images were created. A caveat to that is the new version of Evidence Explained says that the narrow microfilm and roll numbers are not necessary any longer because they are so widely available. So this is, I would always argue, over-documenting in your original research is wiser than leaving something out. So I still like to grab the narrow microfilm and roll number, and even if I don't include it in my final citation. Some of these books are published standalone works. In this case, the exact title of the book is written in italics. The same concept would apply to a website, a newspaper, a journal, a CD or a DVD, or a television program. Now, in this example, we have two whats. We have a titled database with images at a website. We're citing the named part, a database entitled Virginia U.S. Wills and Probate Records, 1652 to 1900, which is part of a published website, Ancestry.com. So the title goes in quotation marks, and the title of the published website goes in italics. The term database with images is optional, but if a description like this helps to clarify to the reader what your source is, you should definitely consider including it. Let's look at another record that contains multiple parts. This is an obituary entitled Died. It is a named part in the published newspaper, the Newcastle Current. The title is Died, so it's in quotation marks, and the publication, the Newcastle Current, is in italics. But this is actually a microfilmed copy at my local library, and the microfilm is not published. The title on the film is the name of the newspaper and the date range it covers. So we copied the name of the title exactly and put it in quotation marks. It had no other film number or any other identification. And now I have made a digitized copy of this microfilmed newspaper article, but we won't get into describing that layer. I just want us to get our brains into the process of really analyzing what am I looking at, what format is it in, and what changes might it have gone through. This is an example of a titled unpublished record. It's where what are the session records of Westfield Church, Presbytery, Shenango, June 1st, 1877 to April 12th, 1915. Because it's a titled unpublished register, we copy the title exactly as it is and place it in quotation marks. Church is not capitalized, the months are all in caps, and the first date is missing the comma in between the month and the day. Evidence Explained tells us that setting words in a title in all caps is frowned upon, and if it were a published work, we could correct the capitalization and punctuation in our citation. That way we could let the readers know that we're not the ones making the mistake. However, for an unpublished work, the title should be left as is, and that's why you use the quotation marks to show that you are using exactly what you found. You could add the term sick in square brackets if you wanted to show your reader that you copied the error from the original. But by copying the title exactly, there'd be no doubt if somebody went to this church and was looking for this register that they found the exact source that you looked at. Going back to Alice's death certificate, when I'm documenting this, I would want to note that it's an image of the original unpublished death certificate. It's now been included in a titled database with images, Pennsylvania Death Certificates, 1906 to 1944, on the published website, Ancestry.com. There may be some information that overlaps, like Ancestry is the name of the published website, and it is where this image is accessible. The underlying source information tells us that this is a named record group and series, so that should be included in our what, but it's also included in the where component. So at this point, you really just want to make sure that you're extracting all of these details. If I listed the record group and series in my what column, but end up including it in the where component in my final citation, that's fine. The important part is that we're extracting all of those details. I would also document the physical analysis of this source. I would note that someone wrote over several portions of the certificate in black ink. Other parts are left in blue ink, so I could look at other examples to see if they have different colored ink or see if I can find instructions on how the death certificates were to be completed. In this case, I don't think that that detail matters too much for the greater relevancy of the document, but in some records, a detail like that might mean something. I would also want to point out that this is a collection title that changes. When I first did the citation, the collection was 1906 to 1944. Every year, Pennsylvania releases additional death certificates, and they've been included. So this is a collection title that does change frequently. Again, if you already have something documented, you do not need to go back and change unless you were trying to publish something. But you may want to note if it's a collection that you know changes, you may want to note that so that if a future genealogist is trying to find your source and they find the collection, but the years are wrong, they may know to still go ahead and check that collection. So let's look at another example. This is the deed that I showed before. In this case, when we identify all of our whats, we determine that we're looking at a record copy of a deed of indenture in the unpublished but titled Deed Book G7, which was microfilmed entitled Family History Library Microfilm 863659, which has since been digitized and included in the online collection entitled Deeds 1800 to 1887, Deed Indexes 1800 to 1918, as digital film number 007-42319 on the published website familysearch.org. So this analysis shows that sometimes there's a lot of overlap with your who, what, when, and where. Digital films at Family Search are kind of a special category that deserve a little extra discussion. Most of these films were microfilmed by the Genealogical Society of Utah, and Beaver County, Pennsylvania is no exception, as they did for many other counties over the past decades to preserve historic documents. These microfilms were held and used at and through the Family History Library, so they weren't treated initially as publications. So it has been common and acceptable to call these FHL microfilms. The Family History Library, however, has now published their microfilm collection on familysearch.org, though there are still some access limitations and restraints on some collections. So these microfilms that were considered unpublished are now digital films on a published website. And Evidence Explained replied to a query on their Facebook page a while ago asking whether or not to still include the Family History Library film number. And they encourage genealogists to continue to record the film number, arguing that it only takes a few seconds to add it and it gives another data point to identify and analyze our source in the event questions later arise. So if you would go that route, you just want to treat the digital film number and image number as the where in element instead of the what. The NGSQ, the quarterly, however, has adopted only using the digital film in their published citations. So this is one of those decisions that you will just have to make. And if you're planning to publish, you would definitely just want to check with the editor or publisher to check for their style preference. And it certainly doesn't hurt to record the film number in your working notes. Just like the whats, you'll want to analyze and record all of the whos in your working notes. You really want to get in the habit of gleaning everything you can from a record, ideally the first time you look at it. This will save you time from having to go back to the record because you missed something. Recording all of the whos will add to your understanding of the record. You may not need the neighbors or the witnesses for your final citation, but they should definitely be part of your documentation. Taking the time to record them in your working notes helps to look for patterns, build neighborhoods, and identify relationships. Looking again at Alice's death certificate, I pull out all of the whos from this record. And I really recommend that you don't skip this process because we have a tendency to gloss over or see things that we think are there. It's similar to taking the time to transcribe a record. There's just something about the process of writing or typing the information that allows your brain to focus on these details in a way that may not just happen if you're just trying to quickly rush through it. It's important to not dismiss a piece of information as being wrong. In this case, I have several other more reliable sources for her mother's maiden name, so I can say with confidence that her last name is not Voorhees with a B, but Voorhees with a V. But if this was the only document that I was looking at, I could begin researching on a Voorhees family and hit a brick wall. This could prompt me to look at other examples of my great-grandmother's handwriting or look at the death certificates in the county and find other examples for this funeral home and try to compare the handwriting if I needed to. I just want to quickly mention that I certainly don't document that Ancestry created the database for every record that I examine that's on Ancestry, but I include it here just as a reminder that it is important to understand who created what you're looking at and why. Using the deed again, the whos include the creator of the record, Beaver County, Pennsylvania. We can note the grantor and the grantees, as well as for the benefit of the Westfield congregation. We could include the chain of the previous owners, as well as the names of the witnesses and the recorder. And finally, we can identify who created the microfilm and who created the digital film. This particular deed does not list any adjoining property owners, but if it did, I would include them as well. And guess what we're going to do with all of this information? We'll record all the whens in our working notes as well. This includes the date of publication. If you're citing a will or a deed, it'll include the date that it was written, the date that it was recorded and or proved. If a record was filmed or imaged, record that date. If you're citing anything you found online, you'll also want to record the date that you accessed it. As you're doing this, keep in mind the informant for each piece of information. The doctor likely provided primary information as to the date of death and the duration of the onset of illness. My great-grandmother provided secondary information for her mother's date of birth. The date of burial was provided by the funeral home and is after the date of recording, so there's always a chance that the date is incorrect. The dates at onset of an illness may be an important detail because it may help you prove someone's health status at a particular point in time. No detail is too small to document. For the deed, we'll record the date written and the date recorded. This particular deed gives the additional date of when it was entered into the bound book. I added the date of the cited act of assembly, and because I recorded the names of the previous owners, I would record the dates for the chain of ownership as well. I'll also want to record the date the record was microfilmed and the date we accessed the image. And as I mentioned, Evidence Explained encourages us to record the date of a microfilm or other copy so we can locate exactly which version we viewed in the event multiple copies or films were created. This may be important if a page was omitted or if an image is not clear. The wheres include where something was created, where it was recorded, and where it can currently be found. It can also include information that puts someone in a particular place in a certain time. For instance, if a deed is recorded in one county, but one of the parties is noted as living elsewhere, that information is important to document. Or if you have a letter, the residence location of the sender and receiver is important to note. Generally, you don't need to cite the location of a published source if it's widely available. So if you're citing a book that is available at numerous libraries, you don't need to include the library where you found it. If the record is only available in one or a few places, however, be sure to include the name and address of the repository and the record group or archival box. For the deed we've been looking at, our wheres include where the record was recorded, where is the location of the land, and a specific description of the land. The URL is also included in the where element, so let's look at our options for URLs in a little more detail. As I mentioned, you have a lot of flexibility with crafting your citations, and this is one of them. You can look specifically for records found at familysearch.org and ancestry.com. You can copy and paste the full URL into the citation. This may be especially helpful if it's a persistent URL or an ARK, which is an archival, blanking on archival record key. I'm blanking on that. I'm sorry. I think it is in the handout. But if it's a persistent URL, you can copy and paste the full thing. If there is a string of characters that follows a question mark, like I have emphasized in blue here, generally you can delete that and it won't affect your URL. Always be sure to test it though. The alternative is to use the URL to the collection and then use waypoints to the specific image. The downside of using the full URL is that they tend to be very long. They can be difficult to type if you had a printed copy and you wanted to find the document. Your choice of which URL version may depend on how you intend the citation to be used. If you expect that it will be a digital copy, you can certainly do the full URL. If you think it will be printed, the URL to the collection and waypoints might be a more user-friendly option. So there's the example of the waypoints. The where and when elements are put in parentheses in your citation, and for published sources, a colon separates the location from the publisher. If the where is a URL, you will use a colon to separate the URL from the access date. But notice we add an extra space before the colon separating the URL and the access date. The extra space just gives our eyes a little break so we can more easily see the URL. The access or view date is needed in case a URL changes or is deleted. And you can use a tool like Wayback Machine or go to the date you last accessed a record if needed. Wherein is probably the simplest of the elements. It just pinpoints exactly where to find the specific information you are using. This could include a page number or an image number. If there are no page numbers or image numbers, include information that would be helpful to find the information again, like arranged alphabetically or arranged by date. So on our deed, our wherein includes the page number from the deed book, as well as the image numbers. And if we follow Evidence Explain's model of continuing to cite the family history library film number, we would do that, and the digital film number, those are treated as wherein. We could also use waypoints to quickly find that particular image. So this process will allow you to wring out every possible detail from a source. And now you should have all the necessary information to craft your citation. Now would be a good time to consult Evidence Explained to fine-tune your citation, especially if it's going to contain several layers. A layered citation is when we have the information from the original record plus where you might have found it online. So you want to have the parts separated by a semicolon. So in this case, if you have a copy of the death certificate in your possession, you only have to cite the death certificate. If you found a copy online, like I did in Alice's case, we need to cite the death certificate, the record that Ancestry obtained, image from the Pennsylvania Historical and Museum Commission, and the digital image that we actually looked at. Using the information we already extracted from Alice's death certificate, we can craft what Evidence Explained calls a layered citation, the first part being the original source, the second part being the filmed or digitized version. You do have an option. You can flip those two layers and start with the digital image and then put the information for the original source after the semicolon. It is really up to you, and there are reasons and times when each might be more appropriate than the other. So it is kind of a case-by-case basis. If you are writing something for publication, whichever way you choose, you want to be consistent and do them all the same way. Each of these examples uses the different URL option as well. The first has the URL to the collection with waypoints, and the second has the full URL. The updated version of Evidence Explained also recommends now, instead of having to duplicate all of the information in the second layer, you can often just put imaged at and then the name of whether it's ancestry.com or family search and the URL. These citations, though very different, are both perfectly acceptable. In our working notes, you can definitely over-document to ensure that you don't miss an important detail. For your final citation, though, you'll want to pare down to include only the most relevant information that clearly describes the source and communicates its quality and location. You want to avoid duplication, so if the creator or the who is the same as the what or where, you don't want to duplicate that information. You typically omit the first who element. Some information may be unknown. If that's the case, you have the option to specify it or just exclude it. So for an example, obituaries rarely include the author, but we don't start the citation with author unknown and then proceed to write the rest of the elements. But on the other hand, if a book lacks publication information, you may want to include that no date in square brackets to show that you didn't unintentionally omit a common element. And as we just saw from the layered citation, for the death certificate, you do not have to repeat the same exact information, such as the certificate date or number in your multiple layers. That is where evidence explained can be very helpful to fine-tune these final citations. The order of the elements is slightly different depending on whether the source is a published source or an unpublished source, and these are the two common sequences. The elements in red are not required for all citations. The description of the what is helpful if it's not completely obvious. This could include database with images, digital images, etc. As I mentioned before, we don't need to include the repository for a published source if it's widely available. You'll also want to include the provenance or the chain of custody or a description of how you or someone else obtained a record or image if it's something that is not widely available anywhere else. That could pertain to a family Bible or a sampler, something like that. So remembering that the reason we document is to demonstrate our research extent, to demonstrate a source's quality, and to enable others to replicate the research, let's check the deed citation to see if it meets the criteria. So this citation includes all of the necessary elements to communicate the physical form of both the deed and the digital film that's available at Family Search. I opted to go with the style that NGSQ uses with just the digital film number in my citation. I identified the grantor and the grantee of the deed. I identified the key dates, and I've specified the page number in the book and the URL and the image number to pinpoint exactly where to find it. So this citation is technically correct. However, if I were writing a family narrative and made the statement, sometime before his death in 1804, Charles Clark donated an acre of land to be used as a cemetery by the newly established Westfield Presbyterian Church, a reader might look at my citation and think I made a mistake. This deed doesn't state Charles Clark donated land to Westfield before 1804. This is a deed between Lecky and Fullerton in 1823. It's confusing, and so my technically correct citation does not clearly describe my source. So I can add some clarifying information that I highlighted in yellow just to illustrate this new information. So I would add Lecky, administrator of Charles Clark's estate, to Fullerton et al. On behalf of the Westfield congregation. Now I think my citation adequately described my source. Because this information was specifically stated in the deed, I don't need square brackets, but I could use square brackets if I were adding other types of clarifying information. So let's wrap this up by looking at the two most common ways that you will use your citations, in reference notes and in source labels. I separated the list that I showed at the beginning of the presentation for all the places where we should be documenting our work to show which style is typically used. So the elements and order of citation is exactly the same, whether you're using it in a reference note or as a source label. Reference notes can be footnotes or endnotes, although for most genealogy writing, we use footnotes. You may create a bibliography or a source list. The information and format included in a bibliography is slightly different than what is included in the reference note or source label. We won't be spending time on that today on how to create a bibliography, but the previously mentioned resources will provide information for you to do that. The final standard on documentation addresses separation safeguards, and that's to make sure the citation doesn't get separated from the specific statement or the image of the document. That's why the preference is for footnotes or uniquely numbered notes on the same page as the corresponding text. We can do this also by adding metadata to images or by adding a source label to the image in a place that cannot be easily or inadvertently removed. We don't want to place citations on the back of a document, which could be separated by photocopying or scanning. This is zoomed in just for the PowerPoint, but you can see how if I were to download the image of this deed for use in a research report or in a lineage society application, I could insert the source label directly on the image. The deed actually starts about 4 lines below my source label here. If it's not possible to place the source label directly on the image, you can size the image and insert it into a Word document or into a PDF, and you can create a text box to put the image in a margin. Make sure that you're downloading the images and not taking screenshots. You'll have much higher quality images, and especially if you're planning to print something, it makes it much easier to read. And if you're going to post an image or a family document to a website like Ancestry or Family Search, you can ensure that the citation doesn't get separated by creating a new image file that includes the source label. I wish I knew this a long time ago because I spent a lot of time scanning all of the photos that I had and uploading them to Ancestry. And I've gone back and created citations, but I don't have the citation on the image itself. So if I were to do it over, or for anything that I currently do, I create a new, typically I do a Word document and I post the images. So here I have the front and the back side by side, and then I have my source label right there. So it has the provenance of the photo, also who the current owner is, and information that she gave me permission to share it. There are several ways to do this. You can also just do some of these things in like Photoshop, but I'm just more comfortable with Microsoft Word. But there is linked in the handout. Judy Russell has a video on how to use an online tool. View, Canva is a free program that you can do similar things. So my final tips are just to slow down. We're so used to skimming articles and information. There's no prize for speed in genealogy. So doing quality work takes time and effort. Take time to transcribe records and extract all of the elements that we discussed. The process of retyping word by word causes our brain to be attuned to the details that we might otherwise gloss over. But automate what you can. As I mentioned, there are a lot of templates that you can use. You can also copy and paste relevant portions from the publisher created citations or source information, like the title of a database. I can save myself some time typing. I will. When you paste, you can use Control, Shift, and V on Windows or Command, Shift, and V on Mac, and that will paste the unformatted text. So there are some other ways to do this if your preference is in Google Docs, but that will get rid of any background color or font or size choices that you don't want in your work. And finally, you can build a database of citation templates to use again. Again, I caution you against tweaking a previously created citation by just filling in the new information at the expense of doing a thorough analysis of the record. But if you have analyzed and extracted all of those key elements, you don't have to retype every word of the citation every time. And with that, I will take any questions that you might have.
We do have a couple questions for you. So the first one, someone is asking, do documents saved on our trees on Ancestry.com, do those automatically include the correct citation, or do you make modifications or change how they're saved there?
They do not typically include a thorough citation. Frequently, if you click on the source information, it may say where the document came from. Typically, it might have the repository or the original. If it came from a microfilm and then was digitized, it might have that information, but that still won't, let's say it's a will, it's not going to say which will book it's in. It's not going to say what page it was actually found on. So no, the source information on Ancestry or Family Search does not contain all of the information you need for a citation.
Thank you. Someone else is asking, do you cite online courses? How do you cite those? Do you cite them with handouts, or do you use, how do you go about doing that?
Citing an online course, like I'm trying to think how you would be using the citation for an online course. I mean, if it's a titled thing, the course title should be in quotation marks because it's not a published work. So I would think I'm a little unclear. If somebody wants to, if whoever submitted that, if you want to type back in just to let me know how you're trying to use it, like if you're trying to write a biography or something and describe a course that you took, if that's the way that you're trying to use it, because I'm not exactly sure how why you're citing the online course. Maybe if that could
Thank
be.
you. Oh, they say how to cite the webinar for a genealogy presentation.
Oh, okay, yes. So actually in the handout, it would be the same format. There's a Vimeo video that's posted there, and I have a YouTube video on how to do the URLs. So it'd be the same format. If it's a recorded webinar that you can access again, you would just include the URL to link back to view that webinar. If it's not recorded, you could just put like unrecorded, but the date, the name of the presenter, the date that it was given, maybe the society it was given, or whatever organization. So at least you could document where and when you found that information.
Thank you. Someone's asking, should you get written permission from an individual if you want to use a photograph they've posted to ancestry.com?
That's a very, very tricky one. So, in my opinion, yes. And again, it depends on where you're using it. If it comes up as a hint and you are going to save that photo to your tree without making any changes, alterations, I don't think you need to do that because they have posted it and shared it, and the terms of service on Ancestry are such that once you post it on there, it's on the website for anyone else to use. If you were intending to download it and say use it in your own, if you were publishing a book or you were doing something else, then yes, I think you should get permission. Even that's a little tricky because again, the terms of service are once you upload it, it's now on Ancestry, so you would need to cite where it came from. I think being nice and sharing information is very necessary for all of us to be able to find information on family members that we might not know exist. But at the same time, I personally, I would not. And if it's a photo that's out of copyright, there's no copyright issue that you're worrying about that you're taking somebody's photo and using it. But I think it's always better to err on the side of being polite and nice. And yes, you should ask for permission.
Thank you. And it looks like we have time for one more question, so I'll stick our email here in the chat, genealogy@acpl.info, if anyone has further questions or if you'd like a copy of the chat. And for our last one, someone's asking if you could please briefly review when you use italics and when you use quotation marks in titles.
Sure. So italics are for anything that's really published and generally and widely available. So that could be any book, a DVD, a website, something that is published and widely available. Italics, or excuse me, quotation marks are for anything that is not published, typically not widely available. So anything that you might find like or it could be a part of a whole. So if you're looking at a website and there is a section that has its own title or a chapter in a book, you would put that title in quotations and then the title for either the website or the full book in italics, or like the example of the church register is an unpublished record set, so you put that in quotation marks exactly as the title appears.
Sounds good, thank you. So I think that'll finish us up. We've got lots of good comments and thank yous in the chat. So thank you so much again for presenting for us. We really appreciate your time.
Welcome.
And again,
Thank
thanks. Yeah, our email is genealogy@acpl.info if anybody has any further questions. So thank you, and I hope everybody has a good night.
Thank you.